What terrifies a warrior more, death or becoming irrelevant? Rome didn't fear barbarians at its gates. It feared its own legions realizing their power. Because once a soldier stops fearing death and starts fearing irrelevance, he becomes uncontrollable. History calls them disciplined patriots. History's lying. These men were engineered predators, addicted to dominance, allergic to humiliation, willing to burn the world rather than fade into obscurity. And when their pride was threatened, they didn't negotiate, they mutated. Tonight we step inside the most unhinged units Rome ever created, the mutineers who made their own general blink, the legion that declared war on its homeland, the outsiders who hacked war elephants into trophies, and the ghost army that marched north and never came back. You think loyalty built the Roman Empire? No, ego did. At the Battle of Pharsalus, the fate of Rome balanced on arrogance. On one side stood the Republic's golden boys, wealthy, perfumed aristocrats mounted on shining cavalry horses, convinced victory was their birthright. On the other stood Legio X Equestris, Caesar's bull. When the enemy cavalry charged, tradition said, "Throw the javelins and brace." Caesar gave a different order. Hold them, wait, then aim for the face. Because those young nobles valued their beauty more than the Republic, and when iron punched into teeth, eyes, and cheekbones, something snapped. The charge collapsed, not because they were dying, but because they were being disfigured. Pride broke before bone did. The 10th didn't just defeat Rome's elite that day, they humiliated them, and humiliation is a deeper wound than death. That victory fed their ego like blood and water. This was the same legion that earned the name Equestris through mockery. Before a tense meeting with a hostile king, Julius Caesar didn't trust his allied cavalry to guard him, so he ordered the 10th to seize the horses and ride instead. Infantrymen turned cavalry overnight. One soldier reportedly laughed and said, "Caesar keeps his promises. He said he'd make us his Praetorian Guard, and now he's making us knights." Not obedient, not humble, witty, cocky, self-aware. They knew they were his favorites. They knew they were different, and that knowledge fermented. Victory after victory hardened into entitlement. Entitlement turned into audacity. And in 47 BC, that audacity exploded into mutiny. The 10th, Caesar's prized weapon, demanded double pay. 5,000 veterans who had shattered Gaul and crushed Pompeii now stood as a wall of crossed arms against their own commander. This wasn't rebellion, it was ego testing its creator. So Caesar did something colder than punishment. He walked onto the platform alone and addressed them with one word: Quirites, citizens, not soldiers. In that second, he erased their identity. He stripped them of the title that made them immortal. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable. These hardened killers panicked, not at death, at irrelevance. They begged for forgiveness. They begged to be called soldiers again. They even begged to be decimated, to have 1 in 10 of their own brothers beaten to death by their comrades, just to earn back the name. Think about that. They would rather watch friends executed than live as ordinary civilians. That's not loyalty. That's addiction to status. Caesar took them back. Of course he did. You don't discard a weapon like that. But something had shifted. The bull had shown its horns, not at the enemy, but at Rome itself. They had spent a decade in the mud of Gaul, carving rivers of blood through villages and forests, living closer to their tent mates than to the citizens of Rome. When Julius Caesar told them it was time to cross the Rubicon, they didn't hesitate. They didn't see a river, they saw a finish line. In that moment, Legio XIII Gemina became the first unit in history to formally declare war on its own parents, on the republic that birthed them. And when Caesar warned that funds were low, the 13th reached into their own pockets to bankroll the civil war. Think about that. These weren't mercenaries hired by a rebel. They were the rebels' venture capitalists. They weren't fighting for Rome. They were fighting for the man who promised them everything, even if it meant burning the republic to ashes. In battles like Dyrrhachium and Thapsus, they slaughtered Romans, cousins, neighbors, fellow citizens, without hesitation.
To them, anyone who didn't share Caesar's command was a stranger. And after the dust settled, when the Republic was gone and Caesar's victory absolute, their retirement wasn't a gold watch or a villa in peace, it was a stolen home. They slept in the beds of men they had killed, ate from the plates of the families they had displaced. They didn't just win the war, they inherited the lives of their enemies. This was the moment when the Republic learned a terrifying truth. An army addicted to ego and personal loyalty can decide who rules. And the door they cracked would echo for centuries. Eventually, emperors would rise and fall at the whim of soldiers who knew their own power. But if the 13th were loyal beyond reason, the next legion didn't even start as Roman, and they would end the day wearing the face of a nightmare on their shields. Caesar called them the Larks. It sounded like a joke, a tiny songbird for a legion of tattooed Gauls. But the soldiers didn't mind. They had chosen the crest themselves, plumes like their homeland's larks, forcing Rome to accept their identity into the legions. And on the plains of Thapsus, the song stopped. 60 African war elephants charged, 5 tons of muscle and ivory meant to crush men like insects. Veteran Roman legions panicked. The Larks, they didn't flinch. They didn't throw spears. They ran under the tusks, axes swinging, carving hamstrings and trunks until the monster screamed like men. One elephant grabbed a young camp follower, and a single soldier dashed alone into death, hacking the trunk until the boy fell free. They weren't precise. They were butchers. They didn't find weaknesses. They carved them. By nightfall, the field was a mountain of blood and bone. Elephants slaughtered, fear weaponized. Caesar knew a weapon when he saw one. From that day, the Larks bore the elephant on their shields, a trophy of audacity and death. Outsiders, laughing at monsters, turning the impossible into their legacy. And if the Larks could butcher beasts that made Rome's best men tremble,
the next legion would make human tanks look fragile. King Pharnaces II thought he had the Romans. He launched scythed chariots while the Ferrata was still digging ditches, half-dressed, tools in hand. He expected a massacre. He got an execution. The Legio VI Ferrata didn't panic. They didn't run for armor. They stepped together. 5,000 men interlocked shields until they weren't soldiers anymore. They were a 5,000-ton anvil of jagged iron. When the chariots hit, they didn't find flesh. They found a wall that ate steel and spit terror. The drivers were ripped from their seats, horses butchered where they stood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, an entire army had ceased to exist. Caesar didn't need a report. He needed 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. The Ferrata hadn't just fought a battle, they had rewritten what it meant to be unstoppable. They weren't soldiers, they were a living engine of annihilation. And if the Ferrata could turn surprise attacks into genocide speed runs, the next legion would rewrite fear entirely, diving through rivers fully armored to strike from the water itself. The tribes of Britain had courage, blue-painted skin, and screams that could chill a man's blood. The Legio II Augusta didn't scream back. They didn't charge. They adjusted their aim. This wasn't a battle. It was an experiment in ballistics. At Maiden Castle, they unleashed the Scorpions, torsion-powered iron-tipped bolts capable of piercing 2 men and the tree behind them. Every shot precise, every strike calculated. Archaeologists still find the evidence today. British skeletons with Roman bolts driven clean through the spine. No struggle, no duel, just a projectile from the sky, ending a life before the victim even knew it was coming. 20 towns fell. 30 pitched battles were erased under the cold mathematics of Roman engineering. The Augusta didn't just conquer Britain, they turned it into a laboratory of slaughter, a place where courage met calculation and lost. Fear didn't chase them, it was delivered with unerring accuracy. And if the Augusta could erase entire villages with bolts, the next legion would vanish entirely, leaving only mist, whispers, and a terror so absolute Rome built a wall to contain it. In 1170 AD, 5,000 men marched into the Scottish mist. They were the Legio IX Hispana, veterans who had survived the deserts of Africa, the forests of Gaul, and the engineering slaughter of Britain. They marched north to silence the Caledonian tribes, but the Picts weren't soldiers. They were shadows in the trees, masters of guerrilla war, unseen and relentless. The Ninth never marched back. No bodies were ever found, no eagles recovered, no final stand recorded. It was as if the earth itself had opened and swallowed an entire army whole. There were fragments of Ninth Legion stamps later in the Netherlands, confusing and contradictory, but they don't explain the disappearance, they only deepen the phantom. It was as if the Ninth didn't just die, they were erased from the world's memory. When Emperor Hadrian arrived years later, he didn't send a search party, he built a wall. 73 miles of stone, cutting through Britain like a scar. He wasn't marking a border, he was containing a ghost story. Against the Ninth, Rome didn't lose a battle, Rome lost its sense of invincibility. And that's the lesson of the legions. No matter how invincible, disciplined, or engineered, even Rome could face forces it couldn't predict and pay for it in silence and fear.
Rome didn't fear barbarians. It feared its own legions realizing their power, because once a soldier stops fearing death and starts fearing irrelevance, he becomes uncontrollable. The 10th Equestris carved faces of vain nobles like sculptors carving marble, arrogant, unstoppable, begging for decimation when their ego collided with Caesar's authority. The 13th Gemina crossed the Rubicon, funding civil war from their own pockets, cutting down citizens who shared their blood and language, and retiring in the villas of their victims. The 5th Alaudae laughed at elephants, turning the monsters into trophies. The 6th Ferrata became a living wall of iron, devouring scythed chariots as if physics were a suggestion. The 2nd Augusta rained bolts like death itself, calculating each strike to erase villages before the defenders even realized they were under siege. And the 9th Hispana vanished into the Scottish mist, leaving Rome to build walls not to conquer, but to contain a ghost story. Even the Praetorian Guard, the men who would later auction off emperors for their own gain, owes its fearsome reputation to this legacy. Soldiers whose ego and discipline could rewrite the rules of power itself. All of them shared a single trait: they refused to fade. They weaponized discipline, engineering, and ego into something darker than law or honor, a force that decided who lived, who died, and who would be remembered. Rome built walls to keep the barbarians out, but maybe they should have built them to keep the soldiers in, because in the end, the empire didn't fall to an enemy, it fell to its own refusal to be forgotten.
The 10th Equestris carved faces of vain nobles like sculptors carving marble, arrogant, unstoppable, begging for decimation when their ego collided with Caesar's authority. The 13th Gemina crossed the Rubicon, funding civil war from their own pockets, cutting down citizens who shared their blood and language, and retiring in the villas of their victims. The 5th Alaudae laughed at elephants, turning the monsters into trophies. The 6th Ferrata became a living wall of iron, devouring scythed chariots as if physics were a suggestion. The 2nd Augusta rained bolts like death itself, calculating each strike to erase villages before the defenders even realized they were under siege. And the 9th Hispana vanished into the Scottish mist, leaving Rome to build walls not to conquer, but to contain a ghost story. Even the Praetorian Guard, the men who would later auction off emperors for their own gain, owes its fearsome reputation to this legacy. Soldiers whose ego and discipline could rewrite the rules of power itself. All of them shared a single trait: they refused to fade.
They weaponized discipline, engineering, and ego into something darker than law or honor, a force that decided who lived, who died, and who would be remembered. Rome built walls to keep the barbarians out, but maybe they should have built them to keep the soldiers in, because in the end, the empire didn't fall to an enemy. It fell to its own refusal to be forgotten.